It was just another busy afternoon in the heart of the city, the kind of day where the streets hummed with life, and the air was thick with the sounds of honking cars and hurried footsteps. People moved with purpose, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Among them was a woman named Tasha, a nurse who had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled, her sneakers worn from countless laps around the ward, but her spirit was unshaken. Tasha was the kind of person who carried the weight of others' pain without complaint, a healer by nature and a fighter by circumstance. She was tired, yes, but she had one more stop to make before heading home, a quick visit to the pharmacy to pick up her mother's medication. Little did she know, this ordinary errand would soon turn into a moment that would change everything. As Tasha crossed the street, her mind was already racing ahead to the tasks waiting for her at home. She barely noticed the commotion brewing a block away. A small crowd had gathered, their voices rising in a mix of anger and confusion. At the center of it all was a police officer, his face stern, his baton gripped tightly in his hand. The tension in the air was palpable, like a spark waiting to ignite. Tasha hesitated for a moment, her instincts telling her to steer clear, but something pulled her closer. Maybe it was her training as a nurse, that innate desire to help, or maybe it was the look on the officer's face, a mix of frustration and fear that made her pause. Whatever it was, she found herself stepping into the fray, her voice calm but firm as she tried to de-escalate the situation. But before she could even finish her sentence, everything spiraled out of control. The officer, his nerves frayed and his judgment clouded, swung his baton in a wide arc. Time seemed to slow as the baton connected with Tasha's shoulder, the force of the blow sending her stumbling backward. Gasps erupted from the crowd, their shock mirrored in Tasha's wide eyes. For a moment there was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, as if waking from a nightmare, the officer's expression shifted. His eyes widened in recognition, his face draining of color as he realized who he had just struck. Tasha, the nurse who had saved his son's life just months ago, the woman who had stayed by his family's side during their darkest hour, now stood before him, her face a mask of pain and disbelief. The crowd began to murmur, their voices a mix of outrage and confusion. Tasha clutched her shoulder, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The officer, his hands trembling, took a step toward her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the fragile line between duty and humanity. And as the tension reached its peak, as the crowd's murmurs grew louder and the officer struggled to find his voice, one question lingered in the air, unanswered and unresolved. What happens next? The story was far from over, and the consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the confines of that crowded street. But for now, all anyone could do was wait, their hearts pounding in anticipation of what was to come. The officer's name was Greg, and up until that moment he had prided himself on being one of the good ones. He'd joined the force years ago with a sense of purpose, believing he could make a difference in a community that often felt fractured and forgotten. But the job had a way of wearing you down, chipping away at your resolve until the line between right and wrong began to blur. Lately, Greg had been struggling. The long hours, the constant pressure, the endless cycle of calls that seemed to lead nowhere. It was all taking its toll. He'd been on edge for weeks, his temper shorter than usual, his patience wearing thin. And today, of all days, it had finally snapped. The call that brought him to this street had been routine, or so he thought. A report of a disturbance, a possible altercation between a shopkeeper and a customer. But when Greg arrived, the situation was already escalating. The crowd had grown restless, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and frustration. He'd tried to calm them down, to assert control, but the more he pushed, the more they resisted. And then Tasha had stepped in, her presence like a sudden burst of light in the chaos. Greg hadn't recognized her at first. His mind was too clouded, his focus too narrow. All he saw was another face in the crowd, another voice adding to the noise. And in that split second, driven by fear and adrenaline, he'd made a decision he would come to regret. As the baton connected with Tasha's shoulder, the world seemed to freeze. Greg's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. He knew her. Of course he knew her. Tasha had been the nurse on duty the night his son, Ethan, had been rushed to the hospital after a severe asthma attack. Greg remembered the fear that had gripped him as he'd watched his little boy struggle to breathe, the helplessness he'd felt as the doctors and nurses worked to save him. And he remembered Tasha, her calm demeanor, her reassuring words, the way she'd stayed by Ethan's side long after her shift had ended. She'd been a lifeline in his darkest hour, a reminder that there was still good in the world. And now, here she was standing before him, her face etched with pain and disbelief. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their anger palpable. Greg could feel their eyes on him, their judgment heavy and unrelenting. He wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of how things had gone so wrong. He'd always believed he was in control, that he could handle whatever the job threw at him. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he felt anything but in control. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. Tasha, meanwhile, was struggling to process what had just happened. The pain in her shoulder was sharp and insistent, but it was nothing compared to the shock of being struck by someone she had once helped. She looked at Greg, searching, his face for some sign of the man she'd met that night in the hospital. But all she saw was a stranger, someone consumed by fear and anger. The crowd around her was growing more agitated, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. Tasha knew she needed to do something, to defuse the situation before it spiraled. Further out of control, but how? She was just a nurse, not a mediator or a peacekeeper, and yet she couldn't stand by and watch as the tension escalated. Taking a deep breath, Tasha stepped forward, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Everyone, please," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "Let's just take a step back. No one needs to get hurt." The crowd hesitated, their anger momentarily tempered by her calm presence. But Greg remained frozen, his baton still clutched in his hand, his face a mask of guilt and confusion. Tasha turned. To him, her eyes searching his. "Greg," she said softly, using his name for the first time. "Put the baton down. Let's talk." For a moment it seemed like he might listen. His grip on the baton loosened, and he took a hesitant step toward her. But then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice shouted, "You can't just hit someone and walk away." The words seemed to snap Greg out of his daze, his expression hardening as he turned to face the crowd. The tension in the air was thick, the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. Tasha's heart raced as she realized how fragile the moment was, how easily things could spiral out of control. And then, just as it seemed like the situation might explode, a new voice cut through the noise. "What's going on here?" It was a woman's voice, firm and authoritative. Tasha turned to see a tall, imposing figure pushing her way through the crowd. It was Captain Ramirez, Greg's superior officer. Her presence immediately shifted the dynamic, the crowd parting to let her through. Ramirez's sharp eyes took in the scene, the baton in Greg's hand, Tasha clutching her shoulder, the angry faces of the crowd. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. "Officer Greg," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Lower your weapon, now." Greg hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered the baton, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions settled over him. Ramirez turned to Tasha, her gaze softening slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone more gentle now. Tasha nodded, though the pain in her shoulder was still sharp. "I'll live," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Ramirez nodded, then turned back to the crowd. "Everyone, please disperse. This situation is under control." Her words were met with murmurs of protest, but the crowd began to slowly break up, their anger still simmering but no longer boiling over. As the crowd thinned, Ramirez turned her attention back to Greg and Tasha. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Both of you." Tasha's mind raced as she followed Ramirez and Greg to a nearby patrol car. What was going to happen now? Would Greg be disciplined? Would she be asked to press charges? And what about the crowd? Would this incident only deepen the divide between the community and the police? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. The tension that had been building on that street was just the beginning, and the consequences of what had happened would ripple far beyond that moment. As they reached the patrol car, Ramirez turned to Tasha, her expression serious. "I need to hear your side of the story," she said. "But before we get into that, I want to make sure you're okay. Do you need medical attention?" Tasha shook her head, though the pain in her shoulder was still sharp. "I'll be fine," she said. "But I need to know what's going to happen next." Ramirez sighed, her gaze shifting to Greg, who stood a few feet away, his head bowed in shame. "That's what we're going to figure out," she said. "But I need you to understand. This is a serious situation. What happened here today? It can't be swept under the rug." Tasha nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. She had no idea how this would end, but one thing was certain. The story was far from over. And as she stood there, the pain in her shoulder a constant reminder of the chaos that had unfolded, she couldn't help but wonder what the next chapter would bring. As Captain Ramirez ushered Tasha and Greg into the back of the patrol car, the weight of the situation pressed down on all of them. The drive to the precinct was silent, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Tasha sat stiffly, her shoulder throbbing with every bump in the road. She kept her eyes fixed on the passing cityscape, her mind racing with questions. What would happen to Greg? Would this incident blow up into something bigger? And what about her? Would she be dragged into a media storm or worse, become a target for backlash? She had only wanted to help, to de-escalate a situation that was spiraling out of control. Now she was at the center of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Greg, sitting across from her, couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white from the pressure. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and regret. He kept replaying the moment in his head, the swing of the baton, the look on Tasha's face, the realization that he'd hurt someone who had once been a lifeline for his family. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt hollow even in his own mind. How could he possibly make this right? And what would this mean for his career, for his reputation, for his family? Ethan's face flashed in his mind, and his chest tightened. His son looked up to him, believed in him. What would he think if he saw his father now? When they arrived at the precinct, Ramirez led them to a small, dimly lit room. It wasn't an interrogation room, but it felt just as intimidating. Tasha sat down at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Greg remained standing, his posture rigid, as if he didn't deserve to sit. Ramirez closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her arms crossed. "All right," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's start from the beginning. Tasha, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Don't leave anything out." Tasha took a deep breath and began to recount the events, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside her. She explained how she'd been on her way to the pharmacy after her shift, how she'd noticed the commotion and tried to help. She described the moment Greg had swung the baton, the shock of the impact, the way the crowd had reacted. As she spoke, Greg flinched, his guilt written all over his face. Ramirez listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Tasha finished, Ramirez turned to Greg. "Your turn," she said. "What's your side of the story?" Greg hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper as he began to speak. He explained how he'd been called to the scene, how the crowd had been unruly and hostile. He admitted that he'd been on edge, that he'd let his emotions get the better of him. "I didn't recognize her," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know it was Tasha until after." after it happened. He looked at Tasha then, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I never meant to hurt you, I lost control." Ramirez sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose as if trying to stave off a headache. "This is a mess," she said, more to herself than to them. "A big mess." She turned to Tasha. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "With me, do you want to press charges?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Tasha's heart raced as she considered her options. Pressing charges would mean taking a stand, but it could also mean dragging herself into a long, painful process. Not pressing charges might feel like letting Greg off the hook, but it could also be a chance to show compassion, to try to mend what had been broken. Before Tasha could answer, Ramirez's radio crackled to life. "Captain, we've got a situation outside," a voice said. "The crowd from earlier, they're here, and they're not happy." Ramirez cursed under her breath and quickly moved to the door. "Stay here," she said to Tasha and Greg. "I'll handle this." She stepped out, leaving the two of them alone in the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tasha could feel Greg's eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Tasha," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Not now," she said. I just can't." Greg nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He wanted to say more, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But he knew it wasn't the time. Outside, the situation was escalating. The crowd that had gathered at the precinct was growing larger, their anger palpable. Signs reading, "Justice," for Tasha, and "End police brutality" were held high. Their messages clear. News vans had already started to arrive, cameras rolling as reporters tried to capture the unfolding drama. Ramirez stood at the front steps, her voice amplified by a megaphone as she tried to calm the crowd. "Please, everyone, remain calm," she said. "We're handling the situation. We will address your concerns, but we need order." But the crowd wasn't having it. Voices shouted over hers, demanding answers, demanding justice. Among them was Marcus, a local activist who had been fighting for police reform for years. He stepped forward, his voice carrying over the noise. "We're tired of empty promises," he shouted. "We're tired of seeing our community hurt by the people who are supposed to protect us. Tasha is one of us, a nurse, a healer, someone who gives everything to help others. And this is how she's treated? Enough is enough." Ramirez's jaw tightened as she listened. She knew Marcus well. He was a familiar face at protests and community meetings. She respected his passion, but she also knew how quickly his words could ignite a crowd. "Marcus," she said, lowering the megaphone slightly, "I hear you." "I do, but we need to handle this the right way. Let us do our jobs." Marcus shook his head, his expression fierce. Your jobs led to this. How many more times do we have to see this happen before something changes?" The crowd roared in agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and frustration. Ramirez knew she was losing control of the situation, and she had to act fast. Back inside, Tasha could hear the noise from the crowd, the chants and shouts filtering through the walls. Her heart ached as she realized how much this incident had already spiraled out of control. She thought about her patients, her family, her community. She thought about Greg and the pain in his eyes. And she thought about what she wanted, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. This wasn't just about her and Greg anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. As the noise outside grew louder, Tasha made a decision. She stood up, her resolve hardening. "Greg," she said, her voice firm, "we need to talk, not just to each other, but to them." Greg looked at her, confusion and hope flickering in his eyes. "What are you saying?" he asked. Tasha took a deep breath. "I'm saying this isn't just about us anymore. It's about all of them, and if we don't do something, this is only going to get worse." Greg nodded slowly, understanding dawning on him. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Tasha looked toward the door where the sounds of the crowd were growing louder. "I want to face them," she said, together. Greg's eyes widened, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. This was bigger than both of them now. And as they stepped toward the door, the tension in the room was palpable. What would happen when they faced the crowd? Would they be met with anger or understanding? And could they possibly find a way to bridge the divide that had been growing for so long? The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher.